I was struck down by your angel face.
Okay, I started today with an animated story I had done via the Extra Normal site, and I realized, I actually write fiction. That's part of what I do. So I should try to make that a part of this course. So I will incorporate it into the class more, or at least try to draw on that experience for some of what we talk about. I also decided this week that instead of struggling to find thematically appropriate music, I will just feature music by particular artists. So this week's guest artist is Joan Osborne, an underrated, if you ask me, an underrated singer-songwriter based in New York City. I guess he was a little more popular a few years back, but the story you just saw was a performance piece I'd written based on a conversation I overheard and a different disquieting conversation I had had with my own daughter after she saw a Sally Field commercial for Beneva. And I thought of that story today when I was considering the difficulties many of you might face in trying to introduce historically based material when there's little shared knowledge that you can take for granted. All right. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not being that crotchety old man that says, kids today don't know anything. What with the cell phones and the What's-It-Pods and the Google. Why, back when I was young, we knew things. I don't remember them anymore, but by gum, we knew them. Right? I'm trying to avoid that, but to recognize that kids today know plenty, but that knowledge is likely dispersed rather than shared. At the nature of kind of digital technologies, people tend to know what they want to know. So if you have a classroom computer and it's not working, you might have a student in the room who can fix it. Right? If students are interested in historical knowledge, they know it. But if they only want to know about Snooki's baby, that's probably all that they know. So it's more important than ever to set the historical context when the historical nature of a text is important. So let me start with two things here. First, I'm actually going to quote from myself. This is from a book that Dr. Husband and I wrote a couple years back, Daily Life in the Industrial United States, 1870 to 1900. And this is from an introduction to a chapter on consumer culture. And I should say the book is a kind of reference book designed to look at everyday life around the turn of the past century. So this is about consumer culture. Consumers, those who purchased goods and services, had always been vital in the American economy. During the colonial period, many manufactured goods had been imported from England. Trade, both internationally and regionally, had long been part of American life. But in the latter part of the 1800s, there was an unprecedented change in the nature and scope of consumption in the United States. As Richard Oman aptly puts it, the way people made what they needed in our society changed utterly in the last half of the century. Prior to industrialism, the home was the site, or a site of both consumption and work. People tended to live where they worked, be that on a farm, next to a workshop, or near an attached storefront. Even within a household, most products, from soap to clothing, had to be made by hand. With the rise of industry, work increasingly became something people left home to do. That left less time for producing items for personal consumption, requiring additional purchases of goods. Then, of course, much of the work being done in factories was to produce the very items now being sold to consumers. While this brief summary addresses the major changes of the period, it should not gloss over the diverse experiences of Americans. By 1900, 39% of Americans still worked on farms. Even in urban households, there was still plenty of work being done, including the labor performed by paid domestic workers, the unpaid work of cleaning and childcare carried out by homemakers, and the paid piecework or small businesses women ran from their homes. That said, during the industrial era, across classes, Americans began to purchase items that once had been made at home, including food, clothing, and soap. Even products that had long been part of American culture, such as alcohol and patent medicines, were experienced differently by consumers who now bought national brands. To get these items, consumers turned to a new array of sellers, from department stores to mail-order catalogs. A new industry, advertising, emerged to facilitate, or as some would say manipulate, these transactions. To this day, historians and critics argue over whether these changes were good or bad for Americans. Okay, That is a kind of overview of the general consumer culture. The article that I had you read today, or the chapter I had you read today from the Richard Oman book, Selling Culture, Magazines, Markets, and Class at the Turn of the Century, talks a little bit more specifically about consumer culture as mass culture. And I like that Oman writes intelligently and clearly about that moment at the end of the 1800s when we saw the emergence of what's called mass culture, which he defines, as you saw, by saying mass culture in societies like this one includes voluntary experiences produced by a relatively small number of specialists for millions across the nation to share, in similar or identical form, either simultaneously or nearly so, with dependable frequency. Mass culture shapes habitual audiences around common needs or interests, and it is made for profit. And it's notable then that at this period of time, again, the short story becomes part of that mass culture, regularly supplying fiction for this new consumer base. Now, I could elaborate more on that definition, but actually Oman does so himself for several pages, and I think he does so very well. But in the course of the book, he shows the inescapable connections between advanced capitalism and consumer culture, with particular focus on the development of the advertising-based magazine. Now, these magazines primarily raise revenue through advertising rather than subscriptions. Right? So in a sense, what these magazines are selling is their audience. And for magazines like this to be successful in the late 1800s, they needed to have a larger readership and often a national reach than had been the case for magazines in the past. Now contrast that with the subscription-based magazines that I discussed last week. These magazines had a smaller, more elite readership. Some of them were actually traditionally opposed to advertising. Now, it's important to remember that this rise of the advertising-based magazine happened in an era before the internet, before television or radio, when film was in its infancy, and really only major metropolitan areas would have notable theaters. This was largely a reading culture, and many writers of the period made their way by writing short fiction for magazines, even if they later became novelists. In brief, this was a moment when short stories were popular culture. Now, not everyone was reading Kate Chopin and Willa Cather. In fact, there was a range of fiction for a variety of taste, including European-inspired writers like Henry James, down to the dime novels and detective tales, many of which are lost today because they were printed on such poorly made paper. A great book on the genre of the dime novel, Michael Denning's Mechanic Accents, can be found on the link section of the Week 3 guide. But this was a time when a vibrant literary culture made it possible for a number of writers to have careers by meeting a market demand for short fiction. But before we move ahead, let's take a look at where we've been.